Hello to you all from the Caroline Simpson Library here at the Mint. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land I'm speaking from today. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Are you lucky enough to have old photographs of your family? As we become more and more reliant on our phones to capture our lives, old photos and photo albums seem to accentuate the foreignness of the past. If you're lucky, you may have had an elderly member of the family talk you through some of your old images, but not all of us have been so fortunate. Or those chains of knowledge in the family, often oral, have been broken. Those of us who work in libraries, museums and archives can spend much of our lives looking and making sense of family photos of people who are actually not related to us at all. But is this very different to those of us looking at distant photos of our own families? How often are the keepers of family photos giving order to and even curating the lives of people they have never met, and often doing this for living relatives they barely know? Today I'm going to focus on photographs I found in the Caroline Simpson Library at the Museums of History New South Wales, many from a variety of contexts. Like this photograph album, created by two former women Land Army girls, Kay Hearfield from Five Dock in Sydney and Mary Gilbert of Watsons Bay. They established Guildford, their market garden and poultry farm in 1947 at Corridja near Tarmore and Thirlmere in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. The album is a delightful account of their work on the farm and the many visitors who came to help. They sold the property in 1954 and set up home back in Sydney. Here we have Leslie Walford, later well known as a leading Sydney interior decorator, taken around 1933. In this photograph, young Leslie is aged around 5 or 6, and he stands in front of Essie, the Essex Super 6 4-door sedan belonging to his mother Dora. This image, probably taken at Parramatta in 1903, shows an unknown team of skittle players. The score has been chalked up, the alcohol is flowing, and the ciggies have been lit. Many of the team members each nurse a large heavy ball, as if daring any other skittle team in the region to take them on at their peril. This page of images comes from a personal photograph album compiled by Beryl Gertner, who in 1948 became founding editor of Australian House and Garden magazine. We can see a photograph of Beryl in her early days at House and Garden, and what appears to be a pay slip for her first pay as editor. As an organisation that cares for a number of historic house museums and supporting archival material, we are often able to match old photographs with surviving houses, interiors and gardens. A series of photographs taken of the interiors of Marugal in Nowra in 1945 document furnishings that survive almost 80 years later. This piano, dating back to the 1860s, can still be seen in the house. There it is highlighted, as can this bentwood sofa. Have you got photographs at home that capture objects still in the family's possession? Pieces of furniture, objets d'art, or perhaps even clothing worn by your ancestors? It's worth checking out. While the Caroline Simpson Library holds a large variety of formats relating to the history of houses, interiors and gardens, photographs can have their own particular challenges. Working through the photographic collection can be frustrating when many of the individuals in photographs are unidentified. One of the largest single collections of images held by the library is that of the Icon Studio, 5,000 photos shot between May and December 1950 in Martin Place, Sydney. You can see them on the bottom row of this slide. Despite the volume, we think the collection represents no more than 10 days or part days of work. 5,000 images of people living their lives in 1950 completely anonymously. Or are they? While this image of two snazzily dressed women taken by Icon Studio went online some years ago, the figure on the left was identified as Valley Myers, a Melbourne woman who achieved international celebrity in the 1950s and 60s as a dancer, artist, bohemian and muse. The woman on the right remains unidentified. I encourage you to read more about Valley Myers on the MHNSW website and also take a look at the illustrated articles about Icon Studios. You never know who you might identify. While there may be nothing lonelier than an unidentified figure in an old photograph, this image of James Johnson is not far behind. Johnson was the sole survivor of the wreck of the Dunbar at Sydney's South Head on the evening of 20 August 1857. This 20-year-old crewman from Ireland was rescued from the cliff face 2 days after the ship wrecked and 121 people had perished beneath him. He became an instant celebrity in the colony. This appears to be the only known copy of this photograph taken by the Sydney photographic studio Freeman Brothers a few days after the disaster. Engravings were taken from the photograph and used to illustrate at least 3 accounts of the shipwreck published in September 1857. Perhaps just as alone as Johnson was Robert Hunt, one of the officers of the newly established Sydney branch of the Royal Mint and later Deputy Master of the Sydney Mint. Also, the site on which the Caroline Simpson Library is now located. His sisters Sarah and Emily were victims on the Dunbar, having travelled from England, and his work colleague William Stanley Jevons describes in a letter to his family that Hunt had stayed away from work at the Mint for more than a week after the tragedy, searching all the time for some relic or trace of his sisters. A keen photographer, Hunt used his camera to capture fragments of the Dunbar in this photograph, piled up like matchsticks on the shore. Hunt created a cruel memory for himself. Hunt shared his interest in the new art of wet plate photography along with Jevons and Professor John Smith, Professor of Chemistry at the University of Sydney. They exhibited their photographs together at conversaziones, or social gatherings, held by the Philosophical Society of New South Wales. This well-known picture of the construction of Sydney University, taken by Professor John Smith, is filled with half-formed gargoyles and shows Smith on the far left of the picture in a black top hat, timing the exposure. The photograph may also capture Robert Hunt, circled in red. The man in the white top hat is believed to be either Hunt or architect James Barnett. Earlier last year, we acquired a wonderful collection of 42 stereographs dating between around 1858 and 1860, which included this image of Sydney University, as well as other images of Sydney, regional New South Wales, and Tasmania. Most of the photographers are unknown, but at least a small number of the images have been identified as by Smith and Edward Woolstenholme Ward, Deputy Master of the Mint in Sydney. It is possible others may have been taken by Hunt. The images include Circular Quay, Sydney Cove, taken in September 1860, the west side of Pitt Street, looking north, taken again in 1860, the interior of the Telegraph Office, again 1860, and this frustrating image annotated with the note, "Our picnic, January the 2nd, 1860. But whose picnic, or where was it taken? We still don't know. This wonderful image of 3 children in fancy dress taken at Parramatta in 1901 could easily have been one of those anonymous photographs. Luckily, someone has written the name of each child beneath, and the name of Tom Bray, or variations of the name festooned on each child, give us the biggest clue. Tom Bray was a well-known painter and decorator in Parramatta. This ad from the Cumberland Argus in 1905 shows Bray's shop near the corner of Church and Macquarie Streets, Parramatta. Only 4 years earlier, Tom and possibly his wife Elizabeth decorated their 3 children, Keith, Nellie and Wallace, for a pageant. It's hard to look past these meticulously costumed children, but even the studio setting is interesting, with a painted backdrop of a column and potted plant, a small table and a bench seat decorated with printed and perhaps even beaded floral textiles. We have textile examples in the library that help us imagine this late Victorian photographic studio interior. But let's take a closer look at the children themselves and the way they represent the multiple personas of their father. Keith Bray is 5 years old in this photograph and represents Tom's house painting and glazing skills. Keith holds a paint pot with brushes, a mini ladder, and has slung over his shoulder a small wooden frame, holding window and door glass samples. We have a selection of glass samples in the library, released by James Sandy only a few years after this photograph was taken. They give us a taste of the textures and colours available in building glass at the time. The undoubted star of the trio is Nellie in her wallpaper dress. The oldest of the children, aged 9, Nellie carefully spreads her paper skirt for the camera. The dress consists of a variety of layered wallpaper patterns, including wallpaper borders around the cuffs and the bottom of her dress. The Caroline Simpson Library holds many examples of wallpaper rolls, remnants, and sample books. And you can see examples of similar rosette borders in this sample book from around 1900. Given the extensive wallpaper collection we hold at MHNSW, it seemed a fun challenge to see if we hold any of the patterns on Nellie's dress. The most obvious pattern is the main panel at the front, a Chinese or chinoiserie pattern that is a style that has gone in and out of fashion in the home for at least a couple of centuries. While we haven't found the exact paper in our collection, this much later pattern from the 1960s at least gives you an idea of what it might have been like, even if the colours are a bit different. We kept digging down the layers of Nellie's dress, and at the very bottom, something caught our eye. Here, you might just be able to make out a striped cat's haunch and tail and the words hey and diddle. We were very excited when we recognised this design as a nursery wallpaper designed by Walter Crane in the 1870s in England. For the first time, this photograph places this quite famous wallpaper in a painter and decorator's store in Sydney. Coincidentally, we recently acquired a small worn fragment of the pattern as part of a wallpaper collection from Melbourne, but unfortunately, it does not include the cat section. The last of Tom's children is sign writer Wallace. Aged around 8 in this photograph, Wallace is the victim of his father's joke. One assumes alluding to the reputation of sign writers being bad spellers, a failing which is often mentioned in the contemporary press. Neatly painted on his jacket and painting box are the words bomb tray. You can also see in his right hand a mahl stick, the all-important tool with a soft leather head used by painters to support the working hand with a paintbrush. Sadly, Wallace was killed at the age of 25 in France during the First World War. While the kids may not be smiling in their group photo, one can imagine the giggles as the three got into position, balancing their costumes and props. Hopefully, it marks a moment of joy for the trio and their parents, which would all too soon be wiped away by the death of Tom Bray only 10 years later at the age of 44 after a long illness. It is death, often after a long life, that causes the movement of family photo collections. These rather striking interior photographs were found in a rubbish skip, along with over thousands of other images, the family library and family possessions in 1995. The images on the screen first came to our attention over 15 years ago when they appeared on eBay. It's not that common to find interior photos of this quality from the 1940s. The images felt like an early version of a real estate page on the web. Curiously, the living room illustrated here contains 2 baby grand pianos, unusual for any home then or now. The seller appeared to know who the photographer was, whose house had been photographed and when. The Caroline Simpson Library has been photographically documenting houses in New South Wales at a point of change for the last 30 years, and it seemed as if we'd come across a photograph doing the very same thing, but almost a century ago. This photograph offers a key to the mystery. Here we have well-known pianist Beatrice Tang, the owner of the 2 baby grands in her living room. Next to her is the international singing star Gracie Fields, who Beatrice accompanied on her tour of Australia in 1945. On the right of Gracie is her brother, Harry Evans, and is her husband, Harry Evans rather, and the brother of the photographer. At the other end of the row is Sylvia Evans, the wife of the photographer, Alan Evans. The photograph was taken at Sydney Airport. We approached the eBay seller and asked more about the collection. It consisted of over 2,000 photographic images taken by Alan Evans of mainly domestic homes belonging to Alan and Sylvia, his family, friends, and employer. Many of these were still in negative form, neatly arranged in envelopes, annotated and dated. There were also some photo prints and some family papers. The Alan Evans collection is now held at the Caroline Simpson Library and represents only a portion of what we believe went out in the skip. Like any family collection, there are photos of family life. Sylvia playing in a rock pool, taking the dog for a walk along the beach, Sylvia speaking to her deaf grandmother through a rolled up magazine, and the all too common group photograph with someone torn off at the end. There are some wonderful photographs of Sylvia in the 1920s, immaculately dressed and often beautifully captured by Alan in a variety of Sydney locations. These include Vaucluse House Gardens, as in this picture, and the Vaucluse environs. The Evanses' back garden, probably the Sydney Botanic Gardens and Middlehead Battery. However, the most important images are those capturing a variety of houses, interiors and gardens in New South Wales between the early 1920s and the late 1950s. Alan Evans married his childhood sweetheart, Sylvia Winifred Henderson, in 1927, and together they built their first home, Alwyn, in Arncliffe, in southwest Sydney. Photographing the construction of the house from its earliest stages, Alan initiated a routine of documenting the homes of his family and friends that will continue for over 30 years. Employed as an accountant for Davis Gelatin Australian Limited, Evans also took his photographic hobby into the workplace, capturing images of the extensive Davis Gelatin industrial garden and factory complex in Botany. He was also a photographer for the company newsletter, the Davis Gelatin Review. In 1933, the Davis firm leased the Cockatoo Island dockyard in Sydney, and Evans documented shipbuilding activity and ship launches there. These work images are a whole other story, and today the focus will be on Alan's home life. As I mentioned, the photographic house documentation is meticulous, and Sylvia, more often than not, appears in many of the images showing their new home. The power of these photos really lies in their mundanity, the simple capturing of everyday life, even if rather posed at times. Here we can see Sylvia sitting at a lead-light window in their brand new home. Here she lounges in the shade of her back garden behind a rather extravagant fountain, positioned not far from the clothesline. The details of the brand new curtains, Holland blinds and furnishings in the Evanses' bedroom are invaluable to the study of the history of the Australian home. We finish with one of a number of views of Sylvia in their study, in front of their main bookcase. The images are so clear that we can read most of the titles on the spines of the books. As you may know, the Caroline Simpson Library holds over 3,000 trade catalogues, consisting of both manufacturer and retail trade catalogues. The retail trade catalogues, filled with objects for sale by stores such as David Jones, Anthony Hordens, Mark Foy's and Grace Brothers, can prove invaluable when looking at old photographs. It has been particularly easy matching the sources of some of the furnishings in the Evans house because pretty well everything appears to be brand new at the time it was photographed. Such examples include this lounge suite, which is a combination of two models being offered by Grace Brothers in the late 1920s. In this wonderful image of Sylvia in the study, we have been able to identify the Heckler radiator at her feet, sold by W.W. Campbell & Co. We've even been able to identify the Evanses' Cavaliers fire screen set in front of the fireplace here. We found it in a contemporary Grace Brothers catalogue. As one digs deeper into Alan's photographs of Alwyn, the images start to get stranger and stranger. Here is one of the collection's hero images of Sylvia showing off her new refrigerator, taken on the 22nd of October, 1941. The detail is so good that one can look into the fridge and identify what the couple were eating. The purpose of this low image of a hall stand in the corridor is not immediately apparent, but gives a great view of the interior finishings of this newly built and decorated interior. I think we can be certain that Sylvia did not have an Etsy store in the early 1940s, but with our modern eye, it does look like she and Alan are photographing clothing for an internet sale. This alerts us to how looking at old photos can be full of traps and how easy it can be to impose our contemporary understanding of the world on our reading of past images. The answer to what looks like peculiar pictures appears to lie in one envelope of negatives containing the following types of material. The couple are clearly experimenting and playing with Alan's camera equipment, creating scenes and even mini dioramas. In this last photo, we can see that Sylvia is holding up the backing board against an outside brick wall. I'll let you guess what the theme of the photograph might be because I haven't worked it out. Alan and Sylvia clearly played with photography as a couple over many years. Alan may have been the stereotypical company accountant by day, but by night, he could be a Hollywood matinee idol. The photographic games played by the couple were never more ambitious than when a stray cross blue heeler kelpie they named Manna entered their lives in the early 1940s. Here you can see Manna looking into a crystal ball. What's unusual about that? And here are the preparations the Evans made in their Arncliffe sunroom to capture the moment. This photo of a photo being taken reminds me a little of both the celebration and ridicule of contemporary influencers on social media. We see people filming themselves in the middle of a street, hanging off a building, and preparing complicated beauty and cooking regimes for the next post. There's something rather familiar about Sylvia and Alan photographing scenarios with their dog. It becomes even more familiar when you realise that this is not a private activity, but one they wish to share with the public. Sylvia's book Tail Up was published in 1944 and written from the dog's perspective. The book was heavily illustrated with Alan's photographs, and here we can see the book and accompanying promotional material. Luckily, the manuscript for the book was also found among the contents of the rubbish skip. We even found examples of Mana's personal stationery with the dog's own letterhead. It is clear that Sylvia corresponded with newspapers and fans in the guise of her much-loved pooch. One could argue that our current obsession with using technology to promote ourselves, interests, and passions is based on habits that lie deep, as long as one has enough time and money to partake in such activity. However, the grand productions that Alan and Sylvia produced in their home have been reduced to what are often technological micro-moments in our current digital age. Mana was clearly family to the couple, and his premature death from a cold in May 1946 shook them deeply. Sylvia writes of the confusion she felt having written as the persona of Mana for some years, and her archive includes letters of commiseration to her from cats and dogs from around the country. In the 1950s, Alan and Sylvia moved from Arncliffe to their newly built house in Mossman, which of course they named Manor House. And here we see one of the only colour photographs of Sylvia tending to her garden in her mid-50s in around 1956. Alan died in 1963 and Sylvia lived on until 1995, when her death resulted in that fateful day that her possessions were thrown into a rubbish skip. Never underestimate the power of personal photo collections in whatever format they take. It can be frustrating trying to understand them, and often you will never solve their mysteries. However, it might be reassuring for you to know that we knew nothing about some of the images I've shown you today when they were first acquired, and their stories have proven to be very rich. I'd like to finish by sharing the library's contact details, and we'd love to help you with any questions you might have. So there we are, we're open 10 to 4 Tuesday to Friday. We're located at the Mint, 10 Macquarie Street, Sydney. Our email's there. And you can actually find us online quite easily by just going to Google, type in Caroline Simpson Collection, and you should find us near the top of the first page. Thank you.